Hi there. Thank you so much for joining this latest installment of the On Philosophy lecture series. I'm Anthony Morgan and I edit a public philosophy journal based in the UK called The Philosopher. This is our latest issue. We've organised this series of online events because our usual way of doing things, which is in person in various places around the United Kingdom, was unfortunately not possible because of COVID. But actually it's proven to be an extremely exciting experiment, these kind of digital dialogues. I was looking through the data from Zoom today on the previous events, and we've had people from 58 countries tuning in so far for the events. It's been running since the 1st of September, and this is one of the final few events. So I'm really glad that people are still tuning in and not too fatigued by an excess of philosophy. The event tonight is one that I've been looking forward to for a long time because Tommy Curry was going to come to Newcastle for one of our live events back in April, but obviously that was around the time that everything changed for the worse. So I'm delighted that at last he's able to give the talk, or in this case, engage in the conversation under the title Philosophy After Racism. Tommy will be in conversation with David Livingstone Smith, and I'm really delighted that two such distinguished philosophers are able to be in conversation tonight. I know they have a great amount of respect for each other's work, and both are kind of preeminent figures in their field. Tommy is now based in the UK at the University of Edinburgh, where he is professor of philosophy. He holds a personal chair in Africana philosophy and Black male studies. He's the author of an extremely highly regarded book called The Man Not. Subtitle is Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood. Back in 2018, this book won the American Book Award. David Livingstone Smith is someone who, at least in the last few years, one would think of as the kind of inhumanity guy. This is very much the sort of focus of his research at the moment. His latest book is called On Inhumanity, Dehumanization and How to Resist It. It was published this year by Oxford University Press. David is based at the University of New England, and his current research focuses on dehumanization, race, and propaganda. So we'll begin the event in just a minute. Tommy and David will be in conversation for probably about 30 minutes. Please send any questions you have to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Anything you want to sort of just bring into the general chat function, just comments or feedback or links you want to send, please send to the chat function. I'll be posting a few things to the chat function myself as we go through, links to Tommy and David's books, their websites, and so on. I think that's everything I need to say. So thank you so much. And I'll hand over to Tommy and David to kick things off.
Hey there, Tommy.
How you doing, David?
I'm doing okay. So you've already been introduced. I'm going to introduce again in an abbreviated fashion to really just to say that I have a profound admiration for Tommy Curry's scholarship, his creativity, his intellectual courage. And I would really recommend to all of you out there, if you haven't read The Man Not, and if you're interested in the nature of race and racism and black male vulnerability in particular, which may sound odd to you, but by the time you finish reading the book, you will understand that. Go out and buy it. It's well worth your deep and sustained attention. It is methodologically sophisticated. It is deeply historically informed. There was a vast amount of research that went into this work. So I could heap superlatives on Tommy's work for a long time, but you're here to hear us converse rather than me expressing my admiration.
I appreciate that.
So there's so many strands in your work, Tommy, so many important strands that we have to really settle on one. And I think for tonight, let's settle on something you said to me a little while ago to begin with, anyway. You said, quote, "I'm finished with the idea that one can just wake up in the morning and study race, or not study race so much as what you meant was write on race or theorize race, right?" So there's a context to you saying that, right? There's the context is something about how philosophers and others go about writing on race. And there's something about a methodological problem and a methodological solution implicit in the background of that. So couldn't you just unpack some of that stuff for us?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think, and we've talked about this question for years. The problem we have with how we approach race is that we don't take it as a sophisticated field of study. The idea within philosophy is that we hire Black people to inform us about their experience, but we don't expect them to contribute to the innovations around method or the debates concerning historiography that we allow other scholars throughout the academy in various fields to contribute to. And the effect of this is that we end up using identity as a metric for how we ascertain whether or not conversations are correct. So, insofar as a Black philosopher says things that approximate the worldview of white liberals, that Black philosopher is accepted as being rigorous, philosophical, and intelligent. To the extent that a Black philosopher engages in the perennial questions of disciplinarity, questions of how we approach a problem, how we study a problem, what constitutes evidence for the claims about certain fields, those philosophers are alienated. So we constantly find, especially around the topics of Black men and anti-Blackness more generally, a problem of white consensus, where the issue is not whether or not what you say or what you write about can be verified or validated across multiple fields, right? Which is usually the test as to whether or not a philosopher can articulate things that can serve as the foundation of physics or natural sciences or some kind of social science program, but rather whether or not enough white people agree with you. And I've written about this previously as a problem of underspecialization, where only the most superficial ideas about race and racism get through into the philosophical literature. Questions of, is there a Black identity, or should there be Black solidarity, or these kinds of questions that seem to go on ad nauseum, right, over and over every generation for 3 or 4 decades. But questions that try to reorient how we see the problem of racism, right, beyond whether or not it's a question of reformism or integrationism, but asking fundamental questions, as I do in my book, for instance, that says, how do we articulate a notion of racialized masculinity that's patriarchal when all the theories that are used to describe Black men previous to the emergence of Black feminism claim they were apatriarchal and effeminate, right? How do we read into history the notion of a Jewish male that's attached to patriarchy, right? When the idea for many centuries, right, was that Jewish men were effeminate, so going so far as to suggest they menstruated. So if the racial characterizations of racialized men, for example, include within them certain notions of manhood or masculinity that work against our common conceptualizations, what is the richness, or what is the kind of concepts that philosophy has to deal with that problem? And the reality is that it has none, because we're not pushing people to read questions or commentaries about history. We're suggesting that the category itself, maleness, feminism, masculinity, patriarchy, does all that work for us. So we need another way of saying this very briefly is, whereas other disciplines reward expertise in the refinement and the reflection over certain topics, philosophy imbues or emphasizes the commonsensical. That when you study race, there is no, or there can be no, specialized knowledge of the area. These are commonsensical views that ultimately are gauged by the extent to which they offend or do not offend white liberals, feminists, reformists, pragmatists. Pick your poison.
Yeah. So there are, I mean, what's one of the things that's, I think, really interesting and disturbing is the response, some of the responses to your work.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, we can say that if we look at the field of philosophy of race, there's a lot of stuff which perfectly matches what you've just described.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes tedious because basically the same things are repeated with minor variations again and again without much real engagement with history. Now, one would think, given the availability of your work and the work of a few others, people would say, "Oh, we've been mistaken about this.
The philosopher
Here's some exciting body of work
yes.
That we can take on board, that we can critique, and so on." But some of the responses that I've come across have been really quite hostile, quite just vile. So there's clearly a very powerful element of resistance, which keeps the status quo in place, or at the very least, guards against it being disrupted.
Absolutely.
How do you think about that?
Well, to be honest with you, it's again, I think this is a function of the ideological apparatus within the field of philosophy and the American university system more broadly. When it's one of those things when you actually look and see if there's any written commentary on the man not practically every, I think we have 22 or 23 reviews, they're all positive, right? They're all glowing, saying this is an intervention, it's groundbreaking, etc. But you're right, when you see some of the reflections on Twitter or Facebook, extremely hostile. And the argument is not about the method, it's often not about the text, it's about the idea that Black men, racialized men generally, but Black men specifically, can be anything different than what we already view them as. So the man not makes a case rooted in epidemiology and social sciences, which suggests, for instance, that when we look at things like sexual violence victimization, or intimate partner violence and homicide, that you're not going to get the kind of causal relationships you see coming out of feminist theory. So a feminist theory is still taking up the Duluth model, which argues that men perpetrate violence or domestic violence or child abuse for power, right, because of masculinity. Then you have to ask yourself a fundamentally different question when you see the data sets about Black men. You have to ask, well, why is it that Black men are reporting higher 12-month prevalence than Black women, and the highest prevalence if compared to all other groups of women in a 12-month period, right? Why do Black men report higher levels of prevalence in sexual victimization and made to penetrate violence, right? The data doesn't allow us to say the same things about Black men that we've been used to saying about white men in society. But we've been so trained reading texts like Bell Hooks and other feminist texts that have bought into the Duluth model, right? The idea that masculinity is causally related to the perpetration of violence within the home, as the basis that we see everything. So this book pushes back on this. It asks simple questions that if we know, for example, that same-sex violence in the United States in these couples have similar, if not higher rates of perpetration, why is it these groups completely disappear from conversations of domestic violence and intimate partner homicide in philosophy? When you look at social work, when you look at psychology, scientists and social workers take up these questions with a certain amount of rigor, answering to empiricism, answering to qualitative data, focus groups, etc. But in philosophy, if you dare say that the 30 years of data have shown, right, that there are similar concerns in same-sex partnerships, be they gay men or lesbian women, sometimes that's shut down immediately. Oh, well, that's homophobic, right? So even the statement of verifiable fact, right, because we're not arguing about interpretation, but just merely uttering that the facts of the world are different than the conceptualizations of theory, brings a certain kind of hostility. And I think that when you're talking about Black men, the caricature of the boogeyman is so solidified within the discipline of philosophy, right? I mean, you have to think about this for a moment. The discipline of philosophy has maybe 75 to, let's be generous, let's say 100 Black men in it. And this is a discipline with over 20,000 people, over 5,000 to 6,000 white women, 11, 12,000, white men, maybe 15,000 white men, depending how you're breaking up ethnicity. And the idea for most philosophy departments is that because you have a small gender gap between black men and black women, right? 45 to 70 or 45 to 100, that justifies not hiring black men. So they'll hire other white women of 5 or 6,000 over. So what we're dealing with is not any kind of rigorous engagement with the demographic or sociological realities of black males. What we're dealing with are the caricatures of black men that have been given are risen to the level of theory.
Mm.
And trying to question this, just introducing evidence to the contrary of what we believe, is considered to be offensive within the discipline.
Yeah.
Right? It's considered to be anti-woman because it disagrees with feminism. It's considered to be anti-liberal and anti-democratic because once you look at black men's conditions and see the failures of the ideas of democracy and pragmatism and communality and even government, because they're victims of harsh forms of state violence, nobody wants to dig into that reality. So you have to exclude them. You have to justify their erasure and their removal from society. And I think these negative stereotypes and caricatures of them are what's kind of promulgated by the university system in America to justify their erasure and their condemnation.
Okay. And really at the heart, I would say that the thread running through every chapter of The Man Knot is black male vulnerability.
Absolutely.
And which stands in stark contrast to the sort of the archetype of the black male monster, the predator, the beast. And you know, it's kind of shocking when you look at, well, the materials in your book, but also the metrics on how black males suffer, especially in the United States. The metrics on all sorts of dimensions, victimization, and you have really brought to light a lot more on that.
Yes.
I mean, it should be, if anything should be common sense, it's the degree to which black males have been trodden on, pathologized, and continue to be that. But oddly enough, that's contrary to common sense.
Yeah, you know, there's such a, I don't want to say fear, but there's such a level of dehumanization. And here I'm gonna draw from your work, right, as a psychological process, right, that enables violence to take place. So if we think about this as kind of effectivity, there is, and what I've learned over the last few years, there's no amount of empirical evidence that seems to be able to change the psychological makeup of many of the scholars professionalized in the United States. And I'll give you a very concrete example of this. If there was a situation where I was arguing with a young female scholar on Facebook, and I made the comment that, well, you know, black men are among the most progressive groups in the United States, comparable, if not exceeding, the gender progressiveness of black women in many cases, or at least in some cases. And that statement alone led to accusations of patriarchy, misogyny, sexism, for saying, now, and imagine that, for saying that black men were not the monsters that we've theorized them as. And that when you look at group dynamics, how they actually believe about gender, family, you know, women working outside the home, their values are extremely progressive. That in itself is taken as an affront. So when we are asked, and I say that to frame this question, if we're asked to think about black male vulnerability, and we're told as scholars or philosophers that part of our job is understanding the humanity of those who are victimized by oppression, but you're offended by something that's both empirically substantiated, but deviates from the caricature you have of black men to sustain your view of gender inequality or feminism or intersectionality, whatever the case may be. It's what I'm suggesting is that it's not possible to understand the suffering of black men and boys, because you need the monster, the boogeyman, the black male misogynist to sustain the arguments for why you think women across all classes and races remain victimized and oppressed. So when we started doing the study, the case study on black males who were victims of sexual violation and child abuse, right? We got all these stories about black men talking about how they were raped by older black women, how they were abused, how they were forced to watch sexual acts. And remember, I think we talked briefly before I started that study a few years ago. And I would go to philosophy conference, and at that point, I was presenting the quantitative data. I was talking about the data sets because at that time they were new. People would say, "Oh, well, we don't have the stories. We can't really empathize because we don't have categories to see black men or boys being victims of child sexual abuse and rape." So we collect these stories, and they're painful, right? They're painful because they're young boys telling you how they've been forced to watch various sexual acts, how they
Mm,
were forced to participate in various forms of oral sex and
mm,
copulation against their will. One young boy talked about how he was being paid to do this by a woman. He was like 9, the woman was 30, right? This is how they talk about their experience. And at no point, right, we had to even put a Q question in there where we asked, well, do you consider this to be an act of sexual violation or rape? Answers no. Do you feel, well, did we ask the question, well, if this was a woman, would you see it? Absolutely, yes, 100% of the time. So black men are being socialized in a world where they're told that the violence that we know empirically, quantitatively, epidemiologically happens to them over and over again, right, for decades and decades, doesn't have a name. And when black men speak of that pain, it doesn't have a category in academic disciplines. And when
yeah.
you try to announce that pain, they say, well, that's offensive because it takes away from the categories that we already established. So black men are really forced into silence
Mm,
because anytime they speak about their vulnerability, it disrupts the acts of perpetration and violence that we have to assert they conduct and perform in the world to sustain our other theories of gender or violent or criminological right
mm,
worldviews, right?
yeah.
And this means that inevitably philosophy, because it doesn't appeal to evidence or history, remains trapped in asserting categorical supremacy. You, even though we know that black men experience rates of domestic violence and sexual victimization comparable to their female counterpart, you have to define them as the rapists, even though they're being victimized by rape, even though they're being have the earliest sexual debut of any group in the United States. You can't recognize that suffering and vulnerability because you need the caricature of the black male perpetrator
Absolutely.
and the misogynist to give currency and motivate and animate your gender analysis, right? And what ends up happening then is, well, as you know, right, we get complacent. Philosophy is told that, well, you want to fit with the people who can get you jobs, who's going to reward and publish your work. So you have to fit, even though we know it's not a fact, right? You have to fit this scholarship into this mold so it can get published in feminist journals, et cetera. You have to fit this mold to get it published in liberal journals, progressive journals, et cetera. And the other, even though it's true, right, the philosopher can't engage with the real world, right? The idea of what's happening in black communities, what's happening to racialized men in the United States, hell, what's happening to black men in South Africa. The Optimist study showed the same thing. High levels of female perpetration against young boys, right?
Mm,
You can't engage those realities because it's not just space, it's there's a dependence on the idea of black men being the boogeymen that American universities and disciplines need to substantiate their claims about reality.
mm.
Because if the black man becomes a victim, if the black boy becomes a victim of white men, white women, black women, the environment, etc., then this idea of his toxic masculinity, his savageness disappears. And you have to view him as a human being that's being affected by his environment and not fundamentally corrupted and conditioned by his nature. Right?
Yeah. You have to accept him as someone who suffers,
Exactly. Exactly.
not just feels pain, but
But
suffers.
suffers, genuinely suffers.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so powerful and so unbelievably tragic. What what do you think it does to black men? I mean, this silencing, this
I think it's horrible.
this dwelling in a world which does not have room to acknowledge
Mhm.
terror and suffering and the infliction of violence and so on.
Well, you know, we've talked about this a lot. You know, why I chose to pursue my master's of public health.
Yeah,
Um, I mean, the consequences are horrible,
yeah,
right? I mean, black men in the United States have the lowest life expectancy. They have the highest rates of downward mobility. You know, I think we come we I think we went back and forth on that article that came out a few months ago showing that black men make actually 51 cents per dollar when you look at incarceration and unemployment. Um, Now imagine that, right? This is what I mean. Imagine a world where you're asked in philosophy to sign on to the idea of eliminating the pay gap. And you generally black men are well supportive of that. But then the minute you bring up that this other gap exists, right? Where white, let's just use the numbers they usually use, like white women make 77 cents per dollar, black women make 61 cents per dollar. And you find out that once you look at incarceration and the removal of black men from society, or even employment after 6 months, black men make 51 cents, and that their rate of wage has not increased since segregation. And someone tells you, well, you can't say that. That conversation is not for you. You know, I've dealt with I've had black men in our discipline tell me that they didn't even want to write papers saying that black men were oppressed because they felt they would be attacked. So I think that in order for many black and other racialized men to exist in the academy, that we take it upon ourselves to shrink our voices and our experience. That despite the data, despite the facts, despite what we grow up in our neighborhoods and in the society in general, we choose to turn away from the evidence and embrace the ideology that we think will gain us employment and respect amongst white liberal peers. And the psychological burden of that, right? Like I could talk to you about weathering, right? The premature, decay of our telomeres. We could talk about John Henryism. There are lots of different like health, right, and epidemiological effects that we can, test, various prevalences and diseases and outcomes for. But one of the most one of the most dangerous things I think that happens to black men is that they're told that in order for them to be recognized or accepted within disciplinarity or within fields, they have to be less adamant about their own humanity.
Yeah.
And this is why in the new piece that I was writing, I was saying that one of the things I like about your work is the focus on dehumanization and the inhumanity that we are all conditioned in multiple ways to accept. I was like, but what I'm really interested with Black male studies is what are the caricatures that mobilize that, right? What are the caricatures of Black men that mobilize the kind of everyday or the routine dehumanizations that we see?
Hmm.
That's one of the things that one of the reasons I was drawn to your work, years ago, because I don't see a lot of scholars dealing with race or gender talk about dehumanization in such a way that it connects to the processes we've seen unfold for centuries. So when you think about what Black men are going through now, it very rarely deviates from the accounts of stories we've seen of Black men in Jim Crow segregation.
I was about to say
Yeah,
exactly that. It hasn't changed much in the
it
last
hasn't changed much.
150 years. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even when everybody likes to start at the Moynihan report, where he's talking about, well, Black men are weak and the community's failing because of matriarchy, et cetera. But what they forget is they say that Black men have no impetus to succeed in the society, that they should go to the military or they should do something else, manual labor, because they have no interest in being educated. They don't want to develop their mind. They resent, right, the mainstream values of society. And this is built off of this racist psychological data and study from people like John Dollard. These ideas are coming from criminologists like Menachem Amir, whose mentors were Wolfgang and Farrakouti. This everything that we know about Black men, the idea that they're hyper masculine or aggressive or they're compensating for masculinity comes from extremely racist criminological theory from the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is we tell Black men and boys that we have to accept this as true. That in order for us to be, because when you're getting to gender theory, right, the gender theory that's coming out of the 70s and 80s, right, and Bell Hooks and Kimberly Crenshaw, et cetera, they're citing the same racist literature, right? They're citing the same racist literature. So we end up claiming that we're getting theoretical advance off of the repetition of decadent theories that have already been refuted. So we know that when someone in the academy says, well, Black people have higher rates of criminal deviance or violent perpetration, oh, that's because of the environment. It's because of class, poverty. And once you control for class, you see the same thing with poor white populations. But when it comes to Black men, well, it's the same data set. It's still the violent perpetration, but that reasoning now switches from environmental, sociological, or ecological explanation to a fundamental issue with masculinity. So we've learned that, well, we answer the general claim about Black deviance with regard to environment, but we answer the claim about Black male deviance with regard to a fundamental corruption of masculinity. And this is solidified in subculture violence theory during the 60s and 70s. So for the philosopher, it really does increase the need to be suspicious of the categories of gender, right? Masculinity, femininity, patriarchy, etc., that are being used to substantiate the claims that these things operate at a psychoanalytic level in Black men. Because as we know with psychoanalysis, while it's a useful heuristic for theorizing, right? Even Freud utilized psychoanalysis on very few cases because he thought that it represented interpretations, right, of how the unconscious would manifest itself. Yet when we talk about Black people and Black men, the idea is that this is some kind of definitive and rigorous science that gives us a direct causal relationship between the ideas in their head and their behaviors. We don't do this for every other group.
Yeah.
Right.
So we've got quite a few questions building up here. I want to shoot some of these questions off to you.
Sure.
So here's one from a listener who says, Tommy, what can female academics do to counter the dominant discourse you rightly describe? Mm-hmm. As a woman, I'm heartily fed up with being shouted down by other women when I try to respectfully disagree.
That's a tough question. I think that the academy has developed in such a way that standpoint epistemology and the experiences of certain groups are thought to be more axiomatically true than other groups. And I've dealt with this myself. I've been at conferences where I've just read a paper and, usually white female academics, but a few Black female academics would just yell at me. And the idea is that you have to stand there, you have to take it, because anything you say about that level of aggression or disrespect would be interpreted as anti-woman and hostile. It's the nature of doing the topic. But what I'm ultimately arguing for is a return to verifiable sources and data. And that doesn't have to be sociological or epidemiological, but it needs to at least at the very least be somewhat historical. And the reason for that is that if we're going to pursue philosophy cannot continue to be the appeal to the intuitions or the constructions of a narrative that only seem to resonate with the people of that grouping. And this is what I meant earlier by consensus. The methodological failure of philosophy is that it depends on the consensus of groups to articulate what is or is not true, even when those things are empirically false.
Yeah.
So we need some sort of grounding. And I think that female academics could do a tremendous good by interrogating some of the racist origins of the gender concept, especially in relationship to Black and Jewish men. And one of the recent essays that I've published is really going back and saying, look, when you look at the gender category as it's being formed in the 1940s with Alva Murdaugh, Helen Hacker, Simone de Beauvoir, they are using Black and Jewish men as the basis of their experience to talk about being oppressed by gender. Because during this period of time, segregation and the Holocaust saw racialized men as feminine and said that their femininity and savageness justified their extermination and enslavement and segregation. So these white women looked at these men and literally, and when I say looked at, I mean, you can literally pull Hacker's essay and there's a chart, the Negro man, the Negro place, the woman's place, and it goes line by line. If the Negro is this, the woman is this, hence the woman is an oppressed minority group. So at the heart of all the gender concepts you get coming out of the 20th century, you have Black and Jewish men there. but we've erased them and we've tried to displace them as part of a problem, not because they have power, not because they've bought into these ideas, but simply because they have the right kind of the same genitalia as white men. And despite the fact that their histories, their extermination, their vulnerability have all been vastly different, we don't want to expand or even rupture the gender category to think differently and more clearly about why they exist in the kinds of downgraded and degraded situations and conditions they suffer under now, and prefer to think about them ideally as oppressors, even when the evidence doesn't support that view.
So there are so many questions coming in here. I'm going to apologize in advance if, as I suspect, we don't get to all of them. So I'm going to, here's one from our Australian colleague, Rob Wilson, who's been doing great work on eugenics recently.
Awesome. Excellent.
Yeah. So Rob says, hi, Tommy and David. Thanks for the conversation. I was wondering whether you think that disciplines other than philosophy are doing a better job of acknowledging and understanding Black male experience than philosophy does. While some comments picked out philosophy as especially bad, others pointed to the racism of sociology, criminology, etc., as barriers here.
That's a good point. I mean, listen, there's no discipline that I could think of in the 20th century, at least, that's going to be absolved for its participation in constructing Black men and other racialized men as rapists and deviants. And you're absolutely right. It goes from anthropology to ethnology to criminology to sociology. I mean, the very idea of hypermasculinity is from white sociologists, right? Taking this up and measuring what they call the female personality disorder in the Negro boy, right, compared to the white man or boy. So I think across the board, you're going to find this in at the very birth of disciplinarity in the United States, if, at the very least. Um, in terms of contemporary work, I think the empiricists have done a better job because even though there's lots of research in sociology that tries to go the hegemonic masculinity route and Black men are patriarchs, there are shining examples where people have said the evidence does not fit the interpretation.
Yeah.
The problem, I think, with philosophy is that there is no evidence. So even if you're trying to wage an argument where you have warrants or if you're trying to make analytic claims, you can load the categories with certain kind of justifications or entailments that connect to other ideological dispositions. So even if you have to explain something like Black men being more progressive, and then the UK, shoots up the Guardian piece that Black men are defecting for Trump, which is false, are defective for Trump. In your mind, you can say, well, I could think that Black men are more progressive than X, but they're still men, hence this is why they're doing X, Y, and Z. And without any kind of evidence or attitudinal methods, ways to test how these things exist in the real world, you're always left on your own personal disposition and, more importantly, how other people support what you think. Because what ends up happening in philosophy is you can have a white liberal that may question some of these ideas, but then the communities that exist in philosophy that give credence and check off on them are communities that believe the same racist idea. And this is inevitably the problem of underrepresentation and the problem of philosophy not having a rigorous methodological engagement with Black philosophy and racism, right? The idea here is that you ultimately have to appeal to people with a similar view and no way to actually adjudicate the empiricism of the matter or the reality of the matter.
See, when philosophers talk about intuitions, I think they need to ask where those intuitions come from.
Absolutely.
And when you start seriously interrogating where the intuitions come from, the intuitions about race and masculinity, and so, of course, that's all very deeply ideologically laden.
Absolutely.
We have to look to history to understand that, and to interrogate these intuitions rather than take them as pointing the way to an accurate understanding. And I think you're absolutely right. Philosophy has kind of freed itself in large measure, particularly outside philosophy of science, from bringing claims before the tribunal of evidence. And that's lethal, right?
It dooms, in a very real way, I think it dooms the discipline in these matters because we've become so politicized over questions of race and gender sexual orientation, and identity, that we can't actually engage in a serious empirical investigation. And even in the UK, it is even in the UK, I hear, appeals to intersectionality. And I remember I was asking, and this is really funny, really quickly. I've been having lots of conversations with people about intersectionality. Most people know that if they read my work, I much prefer interaction variables or multivariate analysis or even social dominance theory, because we can test that and see how the theory plays out in the real world. But we get into these arguments about, well, whether or not racialized men have privilege. And I said, well, can't you test the idea? And they're like, well, Kimberly Crenshaw says X. And I was like, I understand what Crenshaw argues, but is it the case in your own society? And they say, I think so. Now, here's what's funny about that. Scotland doesn't have racially disaggregated data. So Scotland, like many European countries, don't break down race and gender groups in many of the areas like domestic violence, sexual violence, right?
Hmm.
Employment, et cetera, that you would need to come to the conclusion about the claim. Because you don't have the data to do chi-square tests to see whether or not certain associations exist.
Yeah.
So this is what I mean. We take certain things that we hold as a theory or a method, and then when we apply it ideologically. Whereas when you look at how things actually exist in a given society, you can't explain it. You don't even have the data to substantiate it. And this is what I mean when I say that we're not rigorously engaged in how we articulate and study the problem of race. We pick a theory that fits our worldview, that becomes an ideological and interpretive mechanism for us to view all problems. And that's where the buck stops. Knowing about Black people, knowing about Black men, knowing about Black women does not become an issue for the philosopher.
So Ginny Norton writes, thank you for this book and your work. On page 225 of the Man Nut, you state he, and then she has parenthetically Black men as a category.
Mhm.
He is a bridge between the reality of the world and the failure of theory, thought, reason to capture the world due to its own obsession.
Mhm.
End of quote. Oh, where did it go? Hold on. It looks like what I was reading has just disappeared. It's just disappeared. Okay, we're going to go to another one.
Fair enough.
Um, do you think, Tony Williams asks, do you think that the study of truth in the historical context with respect to Black participation in fields will help mitigate the current psychological caricatures of Black men?
Wow. I guess it depends what you mean by truth. The brutality of truth for Black bodies generally, Black men and women, but especially Black men, requires you to engage your dehumanization. So when you look in these fields and explore the histories, you will find nothing but negation. You will, when you look at the contemporary literature, you will find nothing but negation. So I think that there is the potential for Black people and Black men, especially Black men and boys, to be reimagined and empirically validated in a certain way by looking at the truth of what their lives are. And this is why in Black male studies, there's always the emphasis on empirically informed theorization.
Mm.
But I don't think that there is the space or the possibility for this to exist in many fields, because even when you present facts about the world, like domestic violence from the CDC, that's taken as offensive. When you talk about the role that white feminists played in the 1970s in constructing the idea of Black men as public menaces, as needing to be killed or disposed of because they're rapists, there's tremendous hostility to this idea, right? So anything that you say about white people's cherished categories is often met with hostility and threat of unemployment. So I think that there is a need. I certainly think that my work represents that there's the possibility, but I know for a fact that even amongst senior Black male scholars, there is a fear that articulating something against the mainstream would not only doom their career, but sully their professional name. For some reason, I just didn't have that thing in me. right? And I've been told several, and I'm serious, like I've been told
Oh,
several
no, I
times
know.
this.
I'm laughing
Yeah.
because I know you.
Oh no, I know. Yeah, we talk about this all the time. But look, I've been, I've been told several times that despite the success of the book, it could end my career, right? A book that sold thousands and thousands of copies, right? All these reviews, an American Book Award, could end my career because it doesn't uphold the same kind of ideological premises that we're used to in studying masculinity, because it bucks the system of white liberals and white feminists. So imagine being put in a situation in a university structure where actually studying yourself in your group, right, leads to the end of your career, not because you're wrong, but because you're right and you're good at it, right? That's the politics of the unpopularity and the consensus that still overwhelmingly dominates Black philosophy, because Black philosophy is controlled and directed by the interests and needs of white philosophers and white philosophy departments.
So we have a question here from Natalie. I think the correct pronunciation of her surname is Itoke.
Yes.
And she writes, what do you make of the Black feminist interpretation of Black men voting for Donald Trump? Why did the media choose to emphasize the minority of Black men who voted for him versus the majority of Black men who voted against him? How do you explain the continuous scapegoating of Black men for ill behaviors versus the never-ending elevation of Black women who, according to some public intellectuals, saved American democracy and deserve to be rewarded?
Well, I think that this is what happens when Black liberation becomes synonymous with supporting the Democratic National Party. I don't think that we can honestly say that there's any other racialized groups in the United States that are so heavily policed for supporting Democrats as Black people are in the academy. And this goes back to the problem of how Black scholarship is not really at issue, but the Black political performance and its usefulness to the white elite and to the white liberal becomes the issue by which Blacks are given jobs, access to certain fellowships, institutions, et cetera, and general praise within the discipline. Now, as an empirical matter, we now know that that idea that Black men defected towards the Republican Party was false. The Pew data had a 9.6% confidence interval, or 9.6 point confidence interval. So, and we also know that as the NPR data has come out, that number has gone from 20 to 12 and is projected to drop even lower. So we've written an article actually on the 538 data, which was the initial data set showing there was like 20% of Black men that were going to defect for Republicans. And what's interesting about that is that they did not disaggregate Black men from Hispanic and not between Hispanic and non-Hispanic. Said differently, when you look at the Black category they used, they put the Hispanic Black men, which we know are generally more conservative than American-born Black men, and American-born Black men together. So the reason you saw the differential is because the way they coded Blackness did not delineate between Hispanic and non-Hispanic. Now I want you to think about that for a moment. When we went through the data and we found this mistake, we sent it off to a sociology journal. So one of the editors said, this is a fantastic find, let's publish it. The other editor said, let's not, because it's going to upset people, because people believe, this was the only argument, people believe that Black men are more conservative than Black women. But we ran a chi-square test and it didn't even pass it. It showed that there weren't. So this is an example of what happens when you have empirical facts, right, contradicting the overall political ideology.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the real question we have to answer about this is why do Black feminists who are supposed to be charged with being experts in intersectionality and understanding race gender interactions continue to push this narrative about Black men, even though it's not true? And in the article that I have forthcoming that should be out in a few months called Decolonizing the Intersection, what I show is that many of the arguments that Black feminist authors like Bell Hooks or Kimberly Crenshaw are utilizing still depend on subculture of violence theory. Meaning that if you think about the way that Black men have been described in the Black feminist historiography, it's always been through a perpetrator mode and model.
Yeah.
So I'll give you a very clear example of this. When you talk about Black men committing domestic abuse or rape or sexual violence, the argument automatically becomes because of masculine patriarchy, right? That's called a Duluth explanation. When you talk about Black women committing domestic violence or child abuse or sexual violence, it's articulated through trauma, environment, etc. Something's wrong. It's not their nature, it's something wrong with them. That's called an ecological model generally. So what ends up happening is Black feminist articulations of Black men rely on deficit-based models, something saying that they're lack or they're negated by something. So you get pathological responses. With Black women, the idea is that their natures are fundamentally good, and even if they commit the very same acts at the same rates of prevalence, it's because of their environment. So this is a problem with how the theory or how the philosophical outlook or orientation of Black feminism, both in the sociological and historiographic function, constructs Black men through a criminological lens. It's interested in the perpetration of Black men, not the vulnerability of Black men. Whereas with Black women, it de-emphasizes the perpetrator view and emphasizes the ecological or the contextual version or interpretation, right? So
Yes.
I think that the interpretation you got from Black feminists about Black men defecting to the Republican Party fits a worldview. It fits a concept that suggests to us that Black men are already patriarchal, they're already negated by racism, so we should expect hypermasculinity and these kind of defective political ideations to overtake their better interests, right? When in reality, again, we could just look back through the data. I mean, this is again, we can check these arguments. If we look back through the voting behavior, Black men's voting at, let's say it's 12%, mirrors some of the behavior that Black women showed maybe a decade ago in their votes for the Republican Party. So imagine what we're saying, right? We're saying that, let's say in the early 2000s, let's say Black women voted at 9, 10, 12% for Republicans in that election. And you're saying 10 years later, Black men are voting the same thing. So Black women weren't pathological back in the 2000s, but Black men in 2020 are. And this is that kind of ad hoc, that kind of ideological selectivity that we interpret things based on our moment and not based in trends, empiricism, or even historical behavior that allows us to consistently construct Black men as caricatures and not as empirically validated humans who live and are affected by sociology, trauma, and their existence within oppressive structure.
Yes. So there's an assumption there. This is a topic that's dear to my own heart and my own theorizing, of Black men being inherently
Absolutely
pathological, inherently monstrous.
Yes.
Right? So there's no amount of evidence that, if once you accept that, there's no amount of evidence which is going to dislodge it.
Absolutely.
Right? Because even if the pathological behavior is not displayed, which is, of course, the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of Black males, the assumption is that it's in there.
Yep.
Right?
Absolutely.
It's just waiting to come out. So you don't even need to consult evidence or to question interpretations. You have that sort of background assumption.
Well, that's, David, as you know, this is why Black male studies scholars have embraced the term of anti-Black misandry.
Yeah.
Right. It's because it's trying to explain the phenomena of negative characters of men that are hypercharged, right?
Yeah.
By the idea of Blackness. And of course, as you know, through your work, the notion of savagery, right?
Yeah.
So when we look at even, and again, for me, we can test these ideas. We can develop a science. When you're looking at any of the genocides of the 20th century, the Herero, the Armenian, the Holocaust, you will see the overwhelming extermination and negative depiction of the male character.
Yes.
Male groups are the first and primary victims of the propaganda that genocidal regimes use to justify exterminating the group. This is just a fact, right? I don't know any genocide scholar, Holocaust scholar disagrees with me on this. I mean, it's through every text. But then when I say, well, look, if that's true, and we start looking at the ways that historically Black men have been, situated and caricaturized and negatively depicted, overwhelmingly from the 1800s to the present, racial stereotypes are mapped onto Black men. So how and why then is a study of Black men that's trying to articulate how for 200 years these stereotypes have not seriously been questioned, become so offensive to the orders of knowledge that are sustained within Western academy. So you're absolutely right. There's no amount of evidence, there's no argument that's going to override the anti-Black misandry or the racist chauvinism, right? That grounds how racialized men, Black, Jews, Muslim, etc., are depicted in the West. Because the assumption, and this comes on the back of liberal feminism, the assumption is alien or outsider racialized men are dangerous to the interest of the dominant female group, which is usually white women in the United States and Europe. And until we get rid of that, right? German women said the same thing about Jewish men. White
Yeah.
women said the same thing about the Negro, right? These are not passive actors. These white women are actively participating in the construction and proliferation of ideas that suggest that racialized men are going to doom not only their womanhood, right? Because back in the turn of the century, womanhood was synonymous with their racial civilization. So you have these conversations happening, but you fast forward just 50, 60 years, and somehow it all disappears. We didn't know that white women were doing this. We didn't know that these ideological characters were used to sustain disciplines. And that's the most dangerous aspect of what we do in the practice of philosophy. We trust our intuitions and our group-based consensus, the community we belong to, as verification of truth. And in reality, as you know, the historical, the sociological, the scientific, the epidemiological consistently allow us to check and nuance our beliefs and intuitions. But philosophy has not come to grasp with that interdisciplinary approach seriously in regard to how we study dehumanization and racism.
So we have time for one more question. And I think this is a fitting question to end on. This is from Moishe Cahill, who says, Mr. Curry, you just used the remarkably interesting phrase, quote, Black men and boys reimagined, end of quote. This is not a trivial task. I cannot even imagine how one as an individual or one as a member of a group, how this might be accomplished. There's a little glitch in the syntax there. What do you mean by reimagining Black men and boys, and how could this be done?
Oh, well, that's a fantastic question. My hope, and this probably won't happen until well after I'm dead, is that people understand the seriousness that I take behind Black male studies. Black male studies is trying to re-articulate and reimagine how actual categories like patriarchy and racism function. So when you look at societies that are racialized, so look at South African apartheid, look at America, look at Jim Crowism, you will find the same structures, caricatures, propaganda directed towards racialized men. So what I'm really interested in, and I really want people to hear this part, what I'm really interested in is how is it that under the pretense of theoretical advance, intersectionality, deconstruction, psychoanalysis, etc., we see no disruption. In fact, we see continuity between the ideas of Black men now and what Black men were thought to be both in the 19th and 20th century. Said differently, if we have theoretically advanced on the questions of race and gender, why then is there still the static and decadent assumptions about Black men that white social scientists and ethnologists believed in the 1800s and the early 1900s? Reimagining means a break with those ideas. We can test whether or not what we say under intersectionality matches with subculture violence theory, matches with ethnology, matches with ghetto studies, right? So to reimagine that means to break from that and find out what it is that is allowing us to reproduce these static and decadent characters of this group. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and this is what I mean by reimagine. What does it mean to imagine Black men as free? What project or what ability do we have currently to even begin to ask how we could think Black men without fear and danger? And this is what I meant when I said that I'm interested in thinking Black men anew, right? Not as a victim of thought or theory, but of genuine thinking. Because I think thought and theory contain within it the kind of anti-Black misandry I'm talking about. Thought and theory is the product of certain kind of disciplinary and canonical arrangements that have constructed Black, Jewish, Armenian, Muslim men as being threats to Western civilization. And I don't think it's controversial to say that. I think you pick up any historical text for the last 100 years, you're going to find some caricature that says that these groups of men are trying to destroy the West, right? And if you take that as serious, then what we're asking ourselves is, well, what kind of thinking allows us or is capable of coming up with a different hypothesis or result, right? What is it that we need to do to understand, to study, and analyze that allows us to go through a process of looking at these groups of men and come up with something that has not already been reiterated by racist ethnologists or sociologists? And the more important part of the reimagining is, what if you explained all the problems that you claim exist because Black men are deficient, are compensating for masculinity, as being in the minority? And this is a really important part I want to highlight really quickly. If you think about the level of perpetration, let's take something like sexual violence or rape. You're talking about less than 0.5% of the total Black male adult population. There's roughly 12.2, 12.3 maybe adult Black men over the age of 18 in the United States. And let's say you say, well, Tommy, they only convict, half. So let's double that number. They get 5,000 convictions, 10,000. Let's double that number, 20,000. In any of those cases, if I quadruple the number of Black men that are convicted to compensate for what we think is the error, right, of not convicting, it is still less than 1% of the population. So what we do is we have race and gender theories that only describe, not even predict, but only describe the behavior of less than 1% of a population. And we utilize those theories to articulate the other 99%. There is no other group, and I want to be crystal clear about this. There is no other group that exists as a subject or object of theory in the Western Academy that is subject to that sort of violence, where the minority of less than 1% dictates the inherent capacities and nature of the 99%. So whereas Black men who come from poor environments, come off of incredibly harsh and early exposures to violence, early sexual debut, still end up being profound, productive, and positive citizens, right? Those are never the models of how we think about Black men, because we always think about them as the excess of white men's toxic masculinity. So whatever a white man did, Black men do it worse. They do it more savagely. They do it to inflict greater harm and injury. So when I say reimagine, I am talking about this process, right? This process by which we utilize the overwhelming positive prevalence of Black men and boys as an inlet to do good philosophy, to challenge ourselves not to reinvent or simply reiterate on ontological foundations of masculinity, as if that gives us a clear causal explanation for the kinds of deviance we find in the world sociologically. But ask, what is it about Black men's humanity? What is it about their abuse as children from their environment, from their neighborhoods, from their mothers, from their fathers, from what is it about these environments that may produce in the smallest minority of Black men the kinds of things that you see described in Black feminist literature? But on the other hand, what about this 99% of Black men, these amazing, resilient, and revolutionary and militant Black men that have fought colonialism and given their lives to free Black people from slavery, and written letters encouraging Black women to go to school and complete their college education, even when they were off for war in the 1800s? Where's that narrative? See, that's the historiography that Black male studies is trying to grab. It doesn't excuse or ignore, right, the real facts of Black male life, which does include some deviance. But it does not pretend that deviance can't be psychologically or epidemiologically or sociologically explained. So reimagining is to dig into the humanity of Black men, even if it's harsher and is ugly as negations, to find a grounding of theory that allows them to be conceptualized not as brutes and beasts, but as humans and who are always in the process of becoming and living.
I can't think of a more fitting way to end this conversation than that very powerful statement that you've just made. I'm so happy to have had this opportunity to interact with you in this,
absolutely, David,
this context, and I really want to encourage everyone to go out and buy The Man Not. If you enjoyed this conversation, you will get a great deal out of this wonderful book.
Well, thank you to Tommy and David. That was a really fantastic and very moving, very unusual conversation in philosophical circles. So I really appreciate the interaction you had and the the kind of sense of respect between both of your work and how that really came through in the conversation. Thank you to all the people. I apologize to Ginny Norton. The fact that your question disappeared halfway through David reading that was my fault. I thought I'd learned how to use Zoom, but I still haven't. I pressed answer live halfway through and it obviously disappeared. I didn't know it would do that, so apologies. And thank you both to David and Tommy. That was really incredibly interesting and unusually moving hour of philosophy, and I hope that everyone who tuned in enjoyed it. We're back tomorrow with an event which is exploring the early modern philosopher Spinoza in relation to the Anthropocene. So what kind of insights can we find in Spinoza to help us understand better the climate crisis that we are facing? I'll put up a slide for that in a second as we sign off. So just to say once again, thank you so much for Tommy and to Tommy and David. I really appreciate it. And yeah, both the links for Tommy and David's book are in the chat function at the beginning, and I'll repost it in a minute in case that's too far in the past. So thank you very much. Really appreciate everyone tuning in tonight. It was a really great event. Thank you.